Public-private partnerships, often simply known as P3s or PPPs, are a hot topic in the transit world. But even though they come up so often, there's not a lot out there that asks the question and then tries to answer it, are these actually any good? P3s have taken a lot of flack, but also been boosted a ton by industry groups. And by people who think we should go back to some imagined good old days where old transit was built and operated by the private sector. But are P3s maybe not quite as good or as bad as people think? Might they actually be a solution for the future? Let's look into it in what might be one of my favorite videos ever. Hey, I'm Reese and this is RM Transit, a channel with edge-of-your-seat excitement topics like procurement. For me, the discussion of P3s is natural. I spent most of my life in Canada, and these days, most big Canadian transit projects are P3s. Now, on one hand, if you came into this video thinking P3s are bad, that's not going to sit well with you. But on the other hand, public transit investment and expansion in Canada is flourishing. Every single big city has a major public transit mega project going on, and most of them are P3s. Right now, Canada has a lot of political support for public transit investment, including from both sides of the traditional political spectrum, and there's even a lot of policy improvements muddling their way along that really don't have anything to do with the big projects. I think it's worth highlighting right from the top that typically the private sector gets tied to one side of the political spectrum, while public transit very much gets tied to the other. I can't say it for sure, but perhaps cognizance about how transit could play to the interests of people across the political spectrum is part of why it's getting so much support in Canada these days. In Toronto, one of the world's biggest public transit expansions is happening rather uneventfully, mostly funded by the right-wing provincial government and the left-wing federal government. A good reminder to start things with is that public transit has basically always been a public-private partnership. It's almost always been the case that at some point in the transit building process, from drawing up the plans to buying the shovels, the government has handed the work off to private companies. The idea that P3s are a unique opportunity for companies with crazy profit motives to suddenly jump into building transit is exaggerated. That said, modern transit P3s, which go beyond just hiring a company to build you something and are much more all-encompassing, are somewhat novel because transit megaprojects are complicated. You aren't paying to move water through a pipeline or to build a power plant. Transit systems take up vast geographical space, and demand for transit networks is incredibly unpredictable. Even during a COVID-19 type event, we did need water and electricity, but public transit demand was way down. All of this makes getting the private sector involved in building an end-to-end transit solution much more complicated. But it is something that places like the UK, which have been steeped in a desire to privatize anything possible, have been dabbling with for a long time. So what does a modern transit P3 look like anyways? In this video, I'm going to be honing in on a particular type of P3 project that's really popular these days. And that's where the government almost just buys an entire end-to-end subway, train, or light rail service. And that's what most transit people or otherwise are thinking about when they hear P3. And this is called a DBFOM. Infrastructure and finance people love their acronyms. So then what is a DBFOM and why is it so unique? Well, DBFOM stands for Design, Build, Finance, Operate, Maintain, which is really exactly what it sounds like. Everything from designing a transit line to financing its construction and then operating it for some fixed period of time after the fact. And if this is actually possible, it sounds pretty interesting. And as it turns out, one of the best examples of DBFOM I can come up with is one of my personal favorite transit lines, and arguably one of the most successful P3s ever, Vancouver's Canada Line built for the 2010 Winter Olympics. The Canada Line is the type of megaproject that I look back at with awe, and I think people will long study it. The line, a metro which is half above ground and half underground, was built in just a couple of years for less than 2 billion Canadian dollars. And it actually opened early. The Canada Line is an exemplar in smart transit planning. Stations are simple and standardized, trains run completely driverlessly all day and night with high frequency and great reliability. And the line has transformed Vancouver with tons of new transit-oriented development, a super popular zero-emissions airport transit line, and a big uptick in regional transit ridership. It's at this point that we can dismiss some of the more simplistic arguments about P3s. One is that P3s inherently sell off infrastructure to private companies, which certainly isn't usually the case. For example, after 30 years of the Canada Line being in operation, it will be transferred back to the government and the public transit agency that runs the rest of public transit in Metro Vancouver, which is unsurprisingly and perhaps uncreatively known as a transfer. That's sometimes added into the DBFOM acronym. You'll also sometimes hear that such projects have different fares and aren't integrated with the transit system, but that's usually not true. It's not true on the Canada Line, which people typically still call a SkyTrain line, even if the official name is not SkyTrain to distinguish it from the older publicly owned and operated lines. There's also an idea that hangs around the Canada Line that its simple, small stations, which are among the smallest subway stations in the world, are the result of free market cost cutting. But, as it unsurprisingly turns out, that's not the case. The Canada Line was built to a capacity and on a route determined by the public sector, and its lower capacity compared to the other SkyTrain lines is the result of unimaginative politicians who were at the helm when the project was being planned and claimed things such as the fact that it would never hit a single ridership target. It surpassed every ridership target. In much the same way, a lot of focus has been given to the Canada Line's use of cut-and-cover construction, which is a rare case of it actually being used for a modern project in North America these days. Now, of course, cut-and-cover was a cost-saving measure, but it was a wise cost-saving measure. Cut-and-cover tunnels function just as well as tunnels that are bored deep below the surface, which the Canada Line actually does also have along parts of its route where it has to travel under a body of water. But cut and cover is much less expensive, and probably more importantly, it's less risky and can be done much more quickly. The irony with so much of the devil's advocate discourse around the Canada Line, where people do agree that it's really popular and fast and great, but it has all of these issues, is that basically all of the decisions that get criticized, from the small stations to the cut and cover construction, are exactly the things that made the Canada Line what it is. People like the Canada Line because it was built quickly and efficiently, but it was built quickly and efficiently because of the small standardized stations and cut and cover construction. The very reason the Canada Line exists as it does is because the builders were willing to act decisively and actually make trade-offs. And no matter how we do our projects, P3 or not, there's a lot we can learn from that. But things aren't all perfect, of course. Probably the biggest issue with the Canada Line is that, like many P3s, it's isolated. You see, for the private sector to be willing to take on the risk of a transit line like this, they want it to be separated so that they have complete control. And that's meant that TransLink hasn't been able to get the same creature comforts on new Canada Line trains as it has on trains on the rest of the network, because those would be different trains which the consortium running the line isn't used to. Now, that probably could be rectified by opening up agreements and contracts and lawyering up, but that may turn an affordable transit project into an expensive one, and that's probably not worth it for some creature comforts. What's funny is that in the early years, the Canada Line didn't even have the standardized TransLink wayfinding, instead opting for something vaguely similar but very much different. But if the Canada Line is the best case P3, what's the worst case? Many would argue that Seoul's Line 9 would take the cake. Despite all of its issues, I should say that Line 9 is a very interesting project, as a new build, almost entirely underground metro with a blend of local and express services, which you can of course learn more about in my Seoul subway video, but that's where the good things stop. To be clear, the line was less of a complete package than the Canada Line, since it was built by the public sector but then operated and maintained by a private company. Much like the Canada Line, Seoul Line 9 has different branding than the rest of the Seoul system, but even stranger, separate fare gates which passengers traveled through at interchange stations. These gates served a dual role, both counting passengers so that that private company could keep informed about how many people are actually using the line, but also hanging the giant concern of a potential separate fare and fare increase for using the service, as compared to the rest of the Seoul subway. Seoul Line 9 has never actually had a separate or higher fare than the rest of the Seoul subway, but there have been tons of battles between the private company and the government where the company did threaten to implement one. Because the government, quite admirably, did not bend, the private company decided to squeeze things in a different direction. Quite literally. Line 9 was particularly originally quite notorious for its shorter trains and lower service levels, which the operator claimed was completely necessary because of the lower fares. While things have improved a lot in subsequent years, suffice to say the South Koreans are not quite so hot on P3s anymore, and with good reason. Now, you might have expected me to bring up something more local, or fitting for the RM Transit channel as an example of a bad P3. Eglinton Crosstown 13 years in and still not running, anyone? But you see, I think the key phrase here is bad P3. For better or for worse, the Eglinton Crosstown doesn't really follow the P3 doctrine that gave us the Canada Line, so judging it against that doesn't make a ton of sense. The big idea behind DBFOM P3s is private sector innovation, which really should just be called optimization. For the Canada Line, that looked like the government setting a capacity, route, and travel time, and the private sector determining the right solution to solve that problem. The Eglinton Crosstown was very different. The governments involved decided, foolishly I might add, that the project would be light rail, and that it would also be run by the TTC, who, for what it's worth, doesn't even seem that interested in running the line these days. And that means that a lot of the potential vectors for optimization just weren't in play. So instead, the Eglinton Crosstown uses the P3 tool to get a lot of downsides, like those legal and contractual battles without the upsides of a lean transit line that has just enough infrastructure to move the required number of people quickly and efficiently. Unfortunately, writing solid contracts and winning legal battles seems to be a lot of the game with P3s. And while it's great when you have a Canada Line, not every project can be a Canada Line, even if many could benefit from some emulation. One has to ask how much better transit projects could be if efforts were focused on learning best practices and innovation, creating nicer station designs, rather than employing a ton of lawyers. The hilarity of this is most visible by comparison to the Canada Line. Both routes have the same contractual nameplate capacity of 15,000 people per direction per hour, and both routes are similar length, about 19 kilometers, half above and half below ground. But that's where these similarities end. The Crosstown needs giant underground stations to handle the long light rail trains that are required to match the capacity of the rather capacious, stout and short automated Canada Line trains. It took a lot of time and money to excavate these gigantic underground stations, which are subway-sized for a line that doesn't have subway-level capacity. This is all before we consider that while the Canada Line soars above traffic when it leaves the tunnels, the Eglinton Crosstown will trottle down the middle of a suburban street, at best keeping up with surrounding car traffic. In many ways, the P3 has given Toronto a new way to deliver an overbuilt and under-spec'd transit line. What I didn't really emphasize before is that the Canada Line doesn't use the same technology as the rest of the SkyTrain network. And while in this case it kind of works out because a regular SkyTrain uses a wacky, rather unusual technology, and the Canada Line is big enough to justify its own subfleet, sometimes you want a project which is intercompatible with your existing network, and sometimes you just want to extend an existing line, and those type of projects get really dicey with P3s. And to be fair, as I mentioned before, P3s aren't necessarily only DBFOMs. One great P3 example, unless you actually have to use it, is Sydney's Air Rail Link, which is a rail line which extends Sydney's existing trains network to Kingsford Smith Airport with 4 new stations. As it turns out, the entire line and its stations are operated and maintained by a private company. And since that company needs to be paid, the government found an incredibly weird and bad way of doing that, which is charging passengers an extra fare to use any of these 4 stations. Well, it's not all that abnormal to charge extra for an airport train, especially for tourists that have money to burn. I'm not sure the residents of Mascot, who now have to pay an extra fare just to use their local train system, are huge fans. Double-decker trains in a single-bore tunnel is extremely cool though, so at least they get to enjoy that. And it's not just the wacky. The DBFOM model I've talked about in this video has a lot of modifications, such as what I mentioned above with the Eglinton Crosstown, that is a DBFM, with the private company doing maintenance on the trains and infrastructure, but with the TTC operating and staffing those trains. Now, while different letters can be dropped, things are never that simple. When I've talked to people around the world about P3s over the years, there's always been different opinions about each different letter and why dropping it may or may not be a good idea. For example, dropping that private financing can make a ton of sense, since the government can borrow money for far less than the private sector. That is, unless the private financing leads to the pressure that means less money burned on superfluous stuff, like I think you saw with the Canada Line. And what about operating? Well, you could have an existing public operator operate a P3 line that creates a lot of room for blame and buck passing. And having the same companies that built the route operate it for a fixed period of time creates a good incentive to actually deliver a functional transit project. Ottawa LRT, anyone? That project in particular has meant massive fines for all of the companies involved. And that brings us back to the Canada Line one last time. You see, despite how much I like it, there is one glaring problem with this project. As well as it works and as efficiently as it was built, it's much more expensive to operate than the existing publicly owned and operated SkyTrain system. In fact, the Millennium and Expo lines are some of the least expensive transit lines to operate in the world per passenger kilometer. The truth is, well organized, the public sector can be crazy efficient because it doesn't need to make a profit. By comparison, even though building the Canada Line was remarkably efficient, and we can learn from that, the public sector has to pay through the nose to operate it, compared to the Expo or Millennium lines. And that arguably offsets some of those lower construction costs. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in a little over a decade when the Canada Line goes public, and whether its operating costs can be brought way down by combining operations with the existing SkyTrain system. And really, that's the rub. P3s are a tool that can lead to success or flaming disaster. But more often than not, places that have dabbled with P3s, like Seoul for example, seem to go back to doing things the good old way. As the Transit Cost Project highlights, building affordable transit means having a competent public sector that can be a good customer for private companies, but that has so much in-house engineering and planning firepower that it could go and do things on its own. And I think that's a good tool for working with the private sector, whether it's just to build the line or whether it's to build, operate, finance, and maintain it. When the private sector knows that you don't need it, it's going to deliver you a less expensive project because it's going to have to prove its worth. When you're good at building transit, which really is a major goal for big growing cities that want to have a future, and that is a need to build more public transit, why would you bring private companies into the inner sanctum of operations, planning, design, and engineering just to skim a profit? The goal of so many P3s has been marketed as privatizing the risk. But the truth is, that's never entirely possible. And even when things work out, you pay a very high price for the privilege. There's also a ton of risk in the P3 process itself. From private operators trying to gouge the public to legal and contractual whack-a-mole, and the risk that when a project ends up back in public hands, it suddenly needs a ton of unforeseen maintenance and investment, which was sneakily avoided while keeping to the contracts while it was in private hands. Ultimately, private companies just aren't going to build projects if they aren't going to make money. And the government is just better equipped to manage the scope and implications of something like a transit project. And if it isn't today, it should be. There is no free lunch. So that's it. That's my take. P3s are a model, and they're a model that has worked. But that's like saying, hey, look at that 100-year-old woman who smoked her entire life. Maybe if I smoke, I can live to 100. The best transit cities, the ones efficiently building the future of our world's transportation networks, they don't use P3s, at least not in the pop sense. Thanks for watching.